Sumergidos en ella, se vive mejor.
Alivia mi ansiedad.
Me recuerda los mejores años de mi vida.
Le muestra al mundo que existimos.
Puedo conocer infinidad de mundos.
Me muestra mi fuerza interior y la magia que hay en este país.
Reafirma nuestra identidad.
Y nos hace respetar la identidad de otros.
Sumérgete en la cultura con Postobón y RCN.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Inés Santaeulalia. I'm delighted that you've joined us this afternoon to discuss one of the topics that is present in all agendas and programs. Global leaders discuss climate change on a regular basis. There are international summits on the topic of climate change. They signed memorandums of understanding and binational agreements to put a stop to climate change. However, the question is, has this gone beyond a conversation and has it become something that is done, something implementable? I can imagine many of you have had a stopover in Bogota, and currently Bogota is in flames. That gray sky might make you wonder whether perhaps we're losing this battle, the sky over Bogota. Today, we have 4 panelists: Brigitte Baptiste from Colombia, Eliane Brum from Brazil, the British lawyer, human rights defender Philippe Sands, and the American author Rebecca Solnit. These are all very different professionals and profiles, but they are working from various trenches that bring us to the same place, which might be the panel that brings us together today. I could spend more time introducing them, but I believe it will be more interesting to ask them a question and for them to tell us about their experience and those events in their lives that led them to decide to fight to defend the earth and for this to be something central to their lives, to raise their voices to this end. I'd like for them to explain to us, in essence, what makes them be here today, this afternoon. Whoever would like to begin. Philippe, you're to my left, so perhaps we can begin with you. Apologies, I just want to say something else. This will be a somewhat complicated conversation because there are many of us and we will be working with 3 languages. 1, Spanish, 2, English, and 3, channel 3 is Portuguese.
Nice to be here with a wonderful panel to talk about a subject that has been close to my heart for more than 35 years. So my world, from teaching and being a lawyer and also writing books, is very largely informed by the environment. And my first connection with the environment, I remember it very precisely. It was April 1986. I was 25 years old. I had never studied environment. I'd never studied environmental law. It wasn't even taught at my university or at any university in the United Kingdom. And the context was news that began to emerge on the radio, on television, that there had been some accident in the Soviet Union at a nuclear power plant called Chernobyl. And over the next days, increasingly there were reports that radiation was crossing boundaries and being deposited on places far away, farms started to be shut in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in the northern parts of the United Kingdom. And a few weeks later, I was invited to give a talk in Washington, D.C. on the legal aspects of transboundary pollution. And so I'd started doing some research and very quickly discovered there was nothing. There was no textbook on international environmental law. No one talked about international environmental law. That made me interested as to how this had happened. All of the rules of international law that were created in the 1940s failed completely to address that subject. So I started researching, and 2 years later, in 1988, published my first book, which was on Chernobyl and international law, and started to become very involved in environmental issues. And it was around that time that I read a seminal article, to this day, the very best academic article I've ever read on the subject, which was published in 1972 by an American scholar called Christopher Stone, the son of I.F. Stone, actually. It was at the University of Southern California. You can find it on the web, you can Google it, you'll find the PDF of the original. And it has a fantastic title, which is, Should Trees Have Standing? And it posited the idea, revolutionary then in 72, and still sort of a bit revolutionary today, I'm sorry to say, that natural objects should have rights under domestic law and under international law. And reading that article, coupled with the Chernobyl accident, my consciousness changed, and I came to see a gap that existed in the field that I was devoted to, and I became increasingly involved.
Rebecca.
I started around the same time, but you can go all the way back to the beginning. I think when human beings were not very safe and welcoming for me, the natural world was trees, horses, wild things, the hills around where I grew up in Northern California. But I began volunteering with Rainforest Action Network in 1988, and it was part of a revolution for North American environmentalists to start recognizing that what we were calling nature or wilderness was indigenous homeland, that human rights and the environment weren't separate. So I was learning that through that, and actually we have some ways similar paths. I was also an anti-nuclear activist at that time when we thought Ronald Reagan and the USSR might blow up the world, and was going to the Nevada test site where the US and the UK have exploded more than 1,000 nuclear bombs. That drew me into working with the indigenous people whose land it was, who said, we want it back and we want them to stop bombing it. So the anti-nuclear movement and indigenous rights movements really came together. And those two things were important. I stayed involved with them through the 1990s. And then there's a 5-hour version of this story you will not get today. I was very aware of climate change, and for a long time I was like, climate is very important, and so is these other environmental things I was working on. But I had been involved in the climate movement and have been for the last 20 years. And then in the last few years I decided I needed to reorganize my life to focus on climate. It's urgent. This is the decade of decision. I can afford to do work whether I get paid or not. I'm on the board of Oil Change International, a global oil policy analysis and advocacy group, and the advisory board of Bill McKibben's new group, Third Act, and another group, and with my friend Thelma, founded a project called Not Too Late, which is a website, now a book, and some other things all in English to try and address the defeatism and despair and motivate people to do what I think we need to do, build a climate movement more powerful than the fossil fuel interests, kind of empower civil society to act on what we know, which is that the majority of people on Earth want to see climate action, want to see their government spend money on it, are ready to embrace many of the changes, despite all the industry propaganda, the poor job most of the media has done on all the defeatist and doomist perspectives. So that is mostly what I do now is this work. And it's been, people often think activism is noble sacrifice and duty, but the people I've gotten to know and deepen my relationships with climate scientists, climate organizers, frontline community members, there's no better people to spend time with and no better way to live. So I'm there to do the work, but there's a lot of joy as well as a lot of meaning in it. Thank you.
Bueno, en mi caso, desde muy pequeño.
In my case, I was always very close to what we speak of as rural matters in Colombia. Rural life and traveling through the country with my family. These were always adventures that were very meaningful to me. When I had to make the decision of what I was going to work on or study, I felt like it should always be something connected to agriculture or forestry, fishing. And in this thought process, one day the dean of my school brought a copy in the year 1979 of the New York Times. It was not something easy to find in Colombia. Someone had brought it, and it was, of course, a 3-kilo heavy newspaper because of all the magazines and supplement documents. And he said, to make this newspaper possible throughout the country, you would have to cut down 1,000 hectares of the forest. And by tomorrow, we will have thrown or discarded this newspaper. Do you feel it makes sense to be logging trees anywhere in the world to print newspapers? And this is something that was a key moment in my life. And yet these newspapers were presenting on the first page the acid rain discussions and the Stockholm meeting that was being held and the pollution present throughout the world, as well as discussing deforestation. So we begun a internal debate, which I believe is still present today, where we discuss the different ways in which we can approach climate change. But as I reflected on how I wanted to do something meaningful with my life, I decided I was going to be devoted to the environment. And that's what I ended up doing. Good afternoon. What really brought me to this were many events and experiences and stories that I heard over more than 30 years of work as a journalist. But one of these, which was quite significant for me, was that my type of journalist works with people over a long period of time. And for 10 years, I was working alongside riverside communities in the Amazon jungle that had been exposed for a power plant in Brazil. And I learned that Belo Monte, this hydroelectric power plant, led to a very local climate crisis, so much so that in 2020, slightly before the first COVID case reached Brazil, in Altamira, where I currently live, which is deep in the Amazon, a series of children and adolescent suicides occurred. It was teenager suicides, but they were kids when that power plant was set up. And they saw the transformation in their land. And when they became teenagers, there were several suicides occurring over a short period of time. And in the year 2014, one of these people that I was working close to, this man's name was Octavio. And he was a man from the jungle that was born and raised on an island, and he married Maria on that island. And all he knew was that island in the Xingu River. And he was kicked out of that island to build the power plant. He was illiterate. He had been raised and trained on that river, and he signed. They forced him to sign because he couldn't read, and they took everything from him. And when I found this man, he was in the periphery of Altamira, which was the most violent city of Brazil at that point in time. Brazil, which is already one of the most violent countries in the world, and he wasn't capable of telling me what had happened. He couldn't find the words to speak, to explain himself to me. So he began to show me his body. He said, here, this scar was because of a machete that fell on my leg when I was here, and this other scar was because of this other event. And that's when I understood what a climate refugee looks like. Because here we see and work alongside refugees throughout the world, given wars, hunger, and other causes. And even though we can never return to that land, there's something material that remains with you. Perhaps it's the bones of those who have died, the ruins of your house, something that tells you that you had a life there. Whereas climate refugees don't have that. In the case of Mr. Octavio, everything he said he had, all of his memories, became water. And all that was left after he was expelled was limited to his body. That was the territory that he had, all the territory he had. All he had left were the words that were scar words written on his body, because even his father's bones had been lost under the water of this hydroelectric power plant. And this was something difficult for me to learn. This had an impact on me. So I left Sao Paulo and moved to Altamira to be able to speak to this climate crisis from within, hearing the voices of those who are present there. I am a witness every day of what the climate crisis does, because the jungle is perfectly connected. All events are connected, and nothing occurs without there having been a series of events, a chain of events. And I know of the dead. I go to their cemeteries. I go and say goodbye to them. We cry, we dance together. And I believe this is one of the things that brought me here today. Philippe, apart from writing and many other things, has been dedicated over the past few years to the inclusion of genocide as the 5th international crime. Tell us, what real effects or impacts might this have if it were to be the case? For there to be someone having to answer to this crime in the future.
Let me give you the briefest possible potted history of international law. Until 1996, the idea that you had an obligation under international law to protect the environment did not exist at all. There were conventions that dealt with particular issues, biodiversity, drinking water quality, air pollution, so on and so forth. There was no general recognition of an obligation on all states and all actors. That changed in 1996 when the International Court of Justice gave an advisory opinion in a case in which I was involved on the legality of the use of the nuclear weapons. And the 5 permanent members of the Security Council all said the environment has nothing to do with the use of nuclear weapons. 4 small Pacific island countries, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Samoa, and Solomon Islands, said no. The environment is a central part of this question. And they argued, I was one of the lawyers for them, that the environment was part now of the corpus of international law. And the International Court of Justice accepted that and ruled in 1996 that every state has an obligation to protect its own environment and the environment in areas that exist beyond its national jurisdiction. And that was the moment when a big change of consciousness took place in the world in which I exist, the world of international law. To give you the context, as at that time in 1996, and for the previous 50 years, the only international crimes that existed were 4 in number. 1, war crimes, which dates to the 19th century, the 1860s. 2, the idea war crimes is you can't target civilians during armed conflict. 2, crimes against humanity, the systematic destruction of individual human beings. 3, genocide, the destruction of groups. And 4, crimes against aggression, waging a manifestly illegal war. The last 3 only became part of international law in 1945, around the time of the United Nations Charter and the famous trial at Nuremberg. What all 4 crimes have in common is that they focus exclusively on the human. They say nothing about the natural environment. In parallel with that was the rise of human rights law, starting in 1945 with the United Nations Charter, followed by the European Convention on Human Rights, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, the African Convention. Totally silent in their first utterances on the environment. It's all about us. Us, us, us. In 1972, at the first UN Conference on the Human Environment, the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Olof Palme, said we need to start thinking about the environment in terms of crimes. And he used the word ecocide. It had actually been invented by an American sociologist who was concerned about the use of napalm in Vietnam. That's the origins of the concept. And for 40 years, people have begun to talk about it and think about it. About 15 years ago, an English lawyer called Polly Higgins, who sadly is no longer with us, really began to run with the idea and created an NGO called Stop Ecocide. And it made quite a lot of progress, but it didn't get over the line. What it needed was people from the establishment world of international law to get on board. So 3 years ago, a group of 12 international lawyers from across the world, very balanced, every region, every gender, every orientation, completely balanced group of people, were invited to create a working group to define a new international crime, the 5th crime, ecocide, the destruction of the environment. I was co-chair with a wonderful lawyer from Senegal. We worked for a year, and I was very pleased, we were all pleased, that we came up with a consensus definition, which essentially provides that the systematic and widespread destruction of the environment is and shall be a crime under international law. And the accent is put not on corporations, not on governments, but on individual human beings who are responsible for decisions of the kind that you have described. Because actually, states don't take decisions, corporations don't take decisions, individuals take decisions. I'm firmly of the belief if you really want to change things, you have to focus on individual criminal responsibility. So we produced our definition. We were immensely surprised by the reaction within a week. The Secretary General of the United Nations, the Pope, various governments all said, yes, we support this. And the process is now underway. And in fact, we're on the cusp of a very significant moment. In a few weeks' time, the European Union will become the first group of countries to include the crime of ecocide in their new environmental liability legislation. Belgium has become the first country to incorporate it into domestic law. And the big issue will be to amend the statute of the International Criminal Court, which sits in The Hague, to add a 5th international crime. But there is here a fundamental challenge, and we were talking about this, Brigitte and I, before we came in. It's a generational challenge, and I'll end with this. Many of the people who are in power today come from a generation who did not study the environment, didn't talk about environmental law, had no environmental consciousness at all. The younger generations are totally different. And I notice that. I'm involved in many, many international cases on all sorts of terrible things that happen. But when the British newspapers reported that I was going to co-chair a group on ecocide, our 3 children, who were in their 20s, it's the first and only time it's happened in my life, on the same day, WhatsApped me and said, "Dad, finally, you're doing something useful." And I understood with those WhatsApps that there's a generational shift that is going to have to take place. And we frankly don't have time. It's clear that climate change is happening. It's clear that the effects are on us already now. And the question then becomes, what is the role of law? The crime of ecocide cannot of itself protect us from what is coming, but it can contribute to a change of consciousness, and that's the place I think that the law has a significant role, together with social activism, scholarship, journalists, and so on and so forth. So we're at a very exciting moment on the cusp of a very significant change, and my hope is that it is not too little and too late.
Rebecca, proclaiming the death of someone or something contributes to it, and it's a form of sabotage. Where can we find the hope to speak in this way? On the one hand, time is running out, but where can we find the hope required to feel that there is still a chance of success?
Hope is not for when things are easy and promising and good and safe. It's for difficult and dangerous times. And it's not optimism, which is the sense, the belief that everything will be fine and nothing is required of us. I see optimism, pessimism, despair, defeatism, climate doomism as all assuming the future has already been fully decided and we can just accept it. Hope for me is just a sense that the future is uncertain and we are making it in the present with what we do or fail to do. And that's never been more important, I think, than in this decade. 6 years ago, climate scientists told us we had 12 years to get things right on climate before more systems broke down, a lot of destruction became far more irreversible, etc. 6 of those years have happened, some good things have happened, but not nearly enough. So we now have 6 years. And so I think hope is motivating, I think optimism is not motivating. Everything will be fine, I don't need to do anything. But hope, I think you have to have, and people often think that it means being happy, that it's an emotion. I think it's a commitment rather than an emotion, and or a belief that that something's possible, or even just the faith that something is worth doing, whether or not it will succeed. And you can't know if you'll succeed. And a lot of things that don't seem likely, when you look forward, happen anyway. And I've been so influenced by the collapse of the Eastern European states in 1989, none of which even the people who made it happen really imagined would and could happen as profoundly and swiftly and comprehensively as it did at that time, if also imperfectly. I've seen remarkable things happen over and over. The sudden appearance of the Zapatistas on the world stage, and so much else that people said was impossible. So for me, hope is just your commitment to the future and to what you can do in the present. And because we can't know the future, we can't see the future, we don't know what can happen, we learn from the past, and I think a historical grounding, a collective memory is really important. My friend Julian Agwan, a lawyer with the Blue Ocean Law Firm, who in the spring won an extraordinary case in the United Nations to bring, you can probably explain this better than me, bring nations before the World Court for climate crimes, is also a beautiful poet and writer, and he wrote and we quoted it in this book, that indigenous people have a kind of collective memory that makes hope possible. And so I feel that it's so much of what we need to do around climate is better stories, deeper stories, stories that give us power, stories that remind us we have power, stories about how the world has been changed before, how civil society has won before, stories that remind us where we are right now in 2024 was absolutely inconceivable, whether you're talking about queer rights, women's rights, racial justice, anti-colonialism, environmental consciousness and law. We are in a, terrible things have also happened, but 2024 was inconceivable in 1974, and therefore I feel that we can work towards 2074, understanding that we can't imagine it, we can't know any more than those people in 1974 knew what exactly would be the consequences of those actions, but that we're both morally impelled and capable of acting on those beliefs, those values, those commitments to make the best future possible.
Es imposible hablar.
It's impossible to speak of climate change without speaking of politics. And since we're in Colombia, Brigitte, I wanted to ask you about Colombia's current government and President Petro. I don't want us, the President Petro has used several international fora to speak of climate change. In fact, Rebecca said recently at an interview that she had been shocked or surprised by what he had said. But more than the discourse, Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. Is progress being made? Are we going in the right direction? Or is it just a president who says these kinds of things in international fora? Let's see. I will choose my words carefully. Let's see. Colombia has been very active in international forums ever since the Biological Diversity Convention and the Climate Change Convention. Colombia has positioned its policies well and has been very disciplined when it comes to adopting laws and standards. However, when we evaluate these 30 years of international agreements, the achievements have been lacking, very much so. And this has to do with the hard time we have when understanding that biodiversity and sustainability requires a change and a transformation in our livelihoods and in our customs. And this has to do with a commitment and a conversation that we have to have between various sectors of our economy and population. We can't speak of biodiversity as an abstract foreign object. That 80% of Colombians are not tied to it because 80% of Colombians live in cities. Of course, there is a long history of displacement in Colombia. 7 million people who have been expelled from rural areas and moved to urban areas given the violence in Colombia, drug trafficking, and land grabbing. And this is an open wound in Colombia. But what is true is that although we have this awareness, and in October and November, we will host the Biodiversity COP16, unfortunately, this is not something that is present in the government-wide policies and investments. We speak of a bioeconomy, and we speak of limiting extractivism, eliminating oil dependence, but unfortunately, and regardless of the ideological or political group in charge, things continue business as usual. Eliane, you moved to the Amazon 7 years ago, and you've been working as a journalist for several decades. You could be considered a climate correspondent today, for example. But after having read your book and after seeing what you share there, I see you more as a war correspondent. Tell us about what it's like to be there. Tell us about what you have to tell us and whether you feel like we're listening to you from the other side. Well, I see it as though we were in a war, and it's a very different war to the one that is currently occurring in the Ukraine or what is currently occurring in Gaza, although the climate is present in both wars. But it's a war against nature that began before our time and will continue after our time. It's a very long war, and it's a war or a battle that we're losing. This is why I fight to protect it, and I moved to the Amazon 7 years ago because I defend the claim that to have a chance of success at preserving the lives of the next generations and for there to be some level of quality in their lives, for it to not be a completely hostile world, we must make radical changes. Changes in the way we see things, understand things. Awareness. We must understand that our life and our world is where the Amazons are, the jungles are, the tropical jungles, and other biomes, not where the financial centers are located, Washington, Beijing, Frankfurt, Bogota, or Sao Paulo. That's why I went to the jungle, seeking to be very coherent with what I defend. I'm a journalist, so I need to be at the center of the world. I want to be consistent with my beliefs. This is why I went deep in the Amazon instead of staying here. This is a very real war. It's a real war, and there's no way to escape it when you're on the front line. I'm here today, and over these days that I spent here, I receive the messages of what's occurring. Just 2 days ago, they burnt down the kids' school. It was a thatched roof school, and they set fire to it. The invaders of this land, the invaders of public land, they destroyed this school in order to be able to transform this land. These kids were captives of these militant groups. They had guns pointed to their heads, and their parents did too, and this is part of the reality they experienced there. Many people over Christmas time and New Year in this conflict zone are threatened to death. So in these year-end pauses, when some government entities that protect them somewhat and large organizations are less present, many NGOs that provide some protection to them, they leave for vacations at the end of the year. So we have raised funds among all of us to send to those who have been threatened, because otherwise it's in that period at the end of the year when they can easily be killed. When I see this fire at the school near my home, I had never seen what I was seeing at that point in time. I know it's not like companies say that it's X amount of football courts burnt per day. This is a holocaust, an absolute holocaust, because each tree has millions of living beings that inhabit that tree, and each tree is connected to another tree, and every living being is connected to another living being. It's all connected. So when it's hours and days getting burnt down, I see it with my very own eyes, and I know there are animals that are being burnt. Snakes are being burnt. They're dying. Birds that are dying. Insects that are dying. Living beings that are being burnt and that are dying. filled with pain, tortured. That is what's happening on a daily basis there, and we are losing this war. And what holds up this world, as the shamans say, are the indigenous peoples. They say these shamans ensure heaven, but the shamans are dying with these epidemics. So there will be no one left to be able to promise us heaven. It's a beautiful and very present metaphor. This is the war we're living. And to finally answer your question, I feel that we're all screaming. And we're screaming all over the world because we're all dying. We see people dying, human beings and non-human beings dying, but we all scream in pain. And the way I feel or see it is that what I write, what I say, are letters, lost letters, letters that never reach their destination, letters that are never opened. I feel like I face a wall of escapism, of negation, that makes people not understand that we are in a war and that there's no way to escape the war because the war is taking place. We can either wait for it to catch up with us, as has been the case for thousands across the world, or we fight. But capitalism broke or put an end to this survival instinct, regardless of how primary an entity might be. We have that survival instinct. We are under threat. We are running a risk of extinction. We are living a much poorer life than in the past, and we are condemning our children to this generalized negation. And it's about not living, because by negating what's happening, this denial does not allow us to really recognize what we're facing. And these letters that I spoke of are lost along the way. They never reach their destination. They're not read. Philippe, I don't want to get you in trouble. I know pointing the finger at someone for a crime can be quite tricky, but I would like to ask you, after having worked hard on this new international crime, who might be a good first candidate to sit in trial?
And every journalist who interviews me on this subject asks this question. So, to put it in context, there's a sort of strategic thought that has to go in. The moment I utter the name of an individual or a corporation, that individual, that corporation, and all those associated with those worlds will be against the project and will do what they can to stop this terrible crime of ecocide from being adopted because it's going to cause us to have corporate losses or whatever. So I have resisted. My favorite conversation was with a journalist from the Financial Times, a very, very good journalist like you, who said, "Come on, Philippe, tell us, give us some examples of the kind of people or corporations." And I said, "No, I'm just not going to do that, because the moment I do that, we've got opponents." So she said, "Well, can I, in my article following my conversation with you, come up with some suggestions?" And I said, "That's for you, so long as it's not in quotations and it's not attributed to me, that is absolutely fine." So she identified one person, and well, actually two individuals. She identified President Bolsonaro and put him on the list, top of the list. And then she added the name of the chief executive officer of ExxonMobil. And I was told from various people that he too has children and they read newspapers, and they don't like it once Dad is fingered as being someone who's responsible. So that was not my view, I hasten to add, but the view of a journalist who took the example. And I think here there is a sort of bigger issue of how we get from A to B. I mean, this has been a really interesting conversation because you've got 3 or 4 people here who are deeply involved in the day-to-day issues. And we have, across all of our worlds, the reality of, frankly, a recognition that the science is clear. It doesn't need to be established. The science is crystal clear, whether it's in relation to oceans or atmosphere or climate or biodiversity. We are destroying the environment in which we have operated. So that is, I think, a scientific reality. But we're confronted with another reality, which is our day-to-day lives. Each of us contributes in our own way. I flew thousands of miles to be here in Cartagena, and in flying, I am contributing to the problem. When we drafted our definition of ecocide, one of the debates that we had, and it could have gone either way, was do we include a list of activities that are ecocidal? Deforestation, ocean dumping, and then big one that everyone, of course, thinks about, climate change. How can you have a list about ecocide that doesn't include climate change? My view was it's better to have no list. Leave it to the judges, leave it to the prosecutors to work out. Because the moment you put in a list, 2 things happen. One, everything that is not on that list is deemed to be fine, but we know that actually it's not fine because in relation to climate change, all human activity contributes. I contribute to climate change on a daily basis. I'm doing my best, pushed in particular by my children to improve my performance and behavior, and I'm trying, I promise, but it's difficult. So if we include a definition that encompasses all of climate change, then every single one of us in this room is an ecocidaire. Is that a socially useful direction to take? I mean, this is the fundamental reality and challenge of how we go forward. The way international law has worked historically is incrementally. And the challenge that we are facing is, I think, existential. I had last April, I mean, my journey to where I've got to has been more gradual and different maybe from the ones that others have taken, but I sort of had an existential, an epiphany moment last spring when I went with some friends and family on a trip out to Utah and Arizona. And at a certain point, we found ourselves at an incredible place, which maybe some of you know, Gooseneck River. It's an astonishing place. You sit on a plateau and you look down nearly a kilometer to a river that has woven its way for 3 million years in the same place. The water level is diminishing for other reasons, but you look at this place and what I saw at that moment is that the challenge that we face is not the destruction of the environment. It will secure itself. It will repair itself. It's us. We are destroying ourselves, which brings me back to a fundamental question about the notion of a project like ecocide. Is it actually about protecting the environment, or is it in fact a roundabout way of protecting ourselves? But the central dilemma that we have, in my view, is that our entire system, legal, political, diplomatic, and other, places the human at the heart of everything. And that has been a mistake. We cannot control our natural environment. It will end up controlling and dominating us. And the fundamental challenge is whether we can affect a change And I have to say, I'm a very, beginning to know me a bit, Rebecca, I'm a sort of optimistic person, but I've got to say, hopeful. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but I've got to say, it's starting to look pretty grim in terms of our capacity to sort ourselves. I mean, the journalist in the FT identified 2 individuals, but take the current government of my own country, a government which, as we speak, is dedicated to extracting every ounce of oil from the North Sea. A total change of policy within the last year in order to win an election at the end of this year, as the Prime Minister put it, to max out fossil fuel use. So what does that say to the rest of the world? A country that is rich, that has industrialized, that has tremendous resources and well-being. What signal does that send to a country like Colombia, or countries in Asia, or Africa, or other parts of the world? It is disgusting. It's totally disgusting. And that is why I think the law provides a means of going forward, but it's the kind of activism that is being discussed that I think has to accompany legal change, or we are in real difficulty.
Creo, Brigitte, que tenías algo que añadir.
Brigitte, I believe you have something to add here.
Siguiendo un poco.
In line with the possibility of creating an international court, there are some complex considerations when it comes to how we develop climate justice. Perhaps this is a space that we can all partake in as witnesses, accomplices, and in some way parties to the conflict. But it's easy to identify the great shortcomings when it comes to access to information, understanding on the scale that the various stakeholders, the activities and scale of the activities that are carried out. Because over the last few years, we've become very used to accusing others. And this is a time in history where we're seeing firsthand the terrible impact of climate change. So there's a great temptation to come out and point the finger and say it's your fault or your fault or your fault. And then when they ask you, how do you know? Where does that data come from? Someone needs to provide that information. This common sense needs to be present. And this is where we begin a very delicate conversation. This is a conversation that will not be resolved if we don't invest in science, technology, and innovation. Because our judges are making decisions on climate matters without a guide to ecology. They're making decisions from their heart, which is good, but not all judges' hearts are in the right place. All struggles and all progress involves some kind of a reaction. Isn't that right, Rebecca? This occurs with feminism and with climate change. Let's speak of denial. I'd like to know about the current situation in the United States. Do you think there is progress? What does the denial there look like? What could you tell us about that balance?
Thank you. 10 years ago, climate denial seemed like a really big problem, and I still find that a lot of people think the job of climate activists, of people who care about climate, is essentially evangelical, to convert climate deniers into climate believers. But they're not, they're mostly people who are deeply identified with the right wing, which is in bed with the fossil fuel industry. They believe what's convenient to believe. And I think actually the reality of climate change, whose underlying truth is that everything is connected, everything has consequences, is offensive to a kind of right-wing libertarian individualism. But denialists aren't the problem. Enough people, the majority of people believe climate change is real. The problem is that we need them all to become climate activists. We need to build climate movements that are more powerful than the fossil fuel industry, that convince governments to not just promise, as so many governments do, and make lovely sounding programs, but to actually fulfill those programs. And so, in a way, denialists become distractions. They like to make a lot of noise on social media. People like Elon Musk love them and give them airspace, but it's like people who say the earth is flat. They're really just mostly need to be ignored, and while we focus on mobilizing and motivating people who already believe. So really, we don't need to convert our enemies. We need to energize and mobilize our friends, I think has always been true for climate. And I've seen the climate movement grow tremendously from almost nothing 15 or 20 years ago, and very, in the global north, very polite and rather timid. But also, the whole game has changed radically, because 20 years ago, renewable energy, solar and wind, were expensive, primitive, utterly inadequate to replace fossil fuel. We've had an energy revolution, which, because it's technical and slow, most people haven't even noticed. But if you actually can perceive where we were, say, in the year 2000 and where we are now, how capable we are of replacing almost all fossil fuel use with renewables, how many of the problems are solvable and being solved also around cement, around agricultural emissions, etc., then you understand that all our problems are political and solvable, but we need movements, civil society, energy, belief, commitment, and really knowledge, because climate is also an incredibly complex subject, and the fact that we've gotten people to think about the chemical composition of the upper atmosphere, the relationship between tailpipe emissions and global temperature and forest fires, which, we've had terribly in California. And, we've done a lot, and we have so much more we need to do. But what we have done, I think, proves that it is theoretically possible to keep doing more. I don't know what doing enough looks like, but I know that everything we do matters. Every 1/10 of a degree of warming we prevent matters. Every place that we can protect matters. Every species we can protect. So I'm sort of hopeful. I'm not optimistic, but I will not quit and as long as I'm still breathing.
Thank you. Nos quedan ya poquitos minutos.
We only have a few minutes left. We're now going to hear a few questions from the audience.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Germán Sena, and my question is for Philippe. The ICC only studies crimes against humanity. What percentage, if we don't consider those that have the veto power, that are the great predators of the Amazon, what do you think we need to have a yes for this ecocide court to judge ecocide crimes? And for Eliane, I feel like we must work further in the Amazon. The Amazon has the largest underground body of water in the world, and we see that there are Chinese and American corporations purchasing land in the Amazon, especially in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Peru. This is not something we've seen much in Colombia so far. What is being done to protect us from this invasion of large corporations purchasing land that should be kept for humanity? That's my question. Thank you.
question on the International Criminal Court. I think people don't want a 1-hour lecture on how the International Criminal Court works, but it's a very important question. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over 4 crimes, the 4 that I mentioned: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. You mentioned crimes against humanity, which is obviously very important. I suspect one of the reasons that you mentioned it is that right now there is and has been an initiative to bring before the International Criminal Court Mr. Bolsonaro for crimes against humanity for the destruction of the Amazon. Here is the legal difficulty with that effort. To prove a crime against humanity, the list of acts are acts perpetrated against human beings. Disappearance, torture, killing, and so on and so forth. The destruction of the environment as such is not listed as one of the acts that gives rise to a crime against humanity. And that is a big gap. The reason for that is that the statute was adopted in 1998, reflected the settlement of 1945, and in 1945 no one was thinking about the environment. So the change of consciousness point is at the fore. The only way you can get issues of the kind that Eliane is addressing in her incredibly important work is to amend the Statute of Rome and include a crime which is explicitly referenced not on harm to human beings, but on harm to the environment. In other words, you need, again, I sound like a broken record, a change of consciousness. Our entire legal system is anthropocentric. It is focused on the well-being of the human, not on the natural world in which the human operates. And it brings me back to Christopher Stone's remarkable article from 1972, Should Trees Have Standing? The essence of the possibility of getting enough states, 2/3 of the 130 or so parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, that's what you need. It will happen. In my mind, it's not a question of whether there will be the crime of ecocide, it's only when. It's definitely going to happen. But when will it happen? But to make it happen fast, you need to really push countries. So each of you who are Colombians should be writing to your government and saying, support an amendment to the Rome Statute. I want to make one other point which is related. There is another court in The Hague. Rebecca alluded to it in terms of the question of being hopeful and what we can do as individuals. There is a case, as Rebecca said, coming to the International Court of Justice, an advisory opinion requested by the General Assembly of the United Nations on legal aspects of climate change. And that, over the course of this year, is going to be litigated. I hope the government of Colombia and hundreds of other people, and governments in particular, will be able to participate in that case. All states around the world are entitled to participate. But again, here we face the reality, which Brigitte mentioned briefly in her closing words. The decision makers in a court, whether it's the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, are judges. Judges are individuals. The judges who tend to sit there now have grown up in a context where they never thought about the environment, they never studied the environment. And speaking frankly, last summer I was at a dinner in The Hague and a couple of judges from the International Court of Justice were there, and they just said to me informally, Philippe, you know, we've got this advisory opinion coming to us on climate change. Frankly, we know nothing about climate change. And that is the problem. It's education, education, education. There is a vast swathe of people out there who know nothing about the subject, and because they know nothing about the subject, they don't care about the subject.
Vamos ya muy justitos, pero si le
I'm afraid we're short on time, but perhaps you can respond to the question. There are many, many people and companies destroying the Amazon. One of the activities carried out is illegal mining, as well as legal mining. And this has to do with these large organized crime cartels that operate throughout the Amazon. It entered to extract water from the Amazon. And the other one has to do with mining, which is, in quotes, legalized, which operates in Brazil. The UK is present there. Canada is present there. All these countries operate there. And they are extracting minerals with grave consequences throughout the entire Amazon and the world. And we see this throughout the world. It's occurring throughout the world. And what needs to happen? They need to take responsibility, not only the companies or corporations, but the banks as well. Everyone involved in this change of events that allows this to occur under the guise of legality. I'd just like to close by saying the following. I have a somewhat different take with regard to hope. I'm not against hope, but I feel that we might reach the time, and I think we are approaching it, that hope might be a luxury we no longer have. So I believe hope is overrated, and we need to fight. We need to fight even if we've lost hope, because when your survival is at risk, you don't sit there and think, do I have hope or do I not have hope? You fight. And what is that fight and struggle? It's one that is looking for and hoping for life. We need to fight looking for life. Where is that life? Where is that beauty? And where is that force? Where are those small things? Affection. These are the things that help and make us fight. Fight for life. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all four of you. I also wanted to express my gratefulness to RCN and Postobon, and of course the simultaneous interpreters that have supported us this afternoon. Please keep in mind that now all four authors will be signing their books. Thank you.